The autumn wind that scoured Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square carried with it the ghosts of bygone wealth and the sharp, immediate scent of roasted nuts from a vendor's cart near the corner. It was a wind that whispered through the skeletal branches of the ancient elm trees, rustled the pages of books held by students on other benches, and carried the distant, rhythmic clang of a city trolley. For Robert Hayes, this wind was an intimate enemy. It found every tear in his threadbare coat, every gap in his worn-out shoes, and delivered a chill that was more than just physical. It was an existential cold, a deep-seated frost that had taken root in his soul a decade ago and had never left. He huddled on his splintered bench, a permanent fixture near the bronze goat statue, and pulled the collar of a coat he'd bought for a tech conference in Dallas. It had been a handsome charcoal blazer then, a symbol of his rising status. Now it was a faded, grimy shroud, its fabric holding the faint, sour smell of damp wool and despair. Its pockets, once home to a sleek smartphone and a wallet full of credit cards, now contained only lint, a smooth stone he'd found by the Schuylkill River, and a carefully guarded secret. He ran a hand over his face, the rough, overgrown stubble scratching his chapped skin. In the polished brass plaque of a nearby donor recognition post, he caught a distorted, wavering reflection of himself. The man staring back was a specter, a hollow-eyed stranger with a wild, tangled nest of graying hair and a beard that obscured the firm jawline he once had. The eyes were the worst part. They were his own deep blue eyes, but they were vacant, haunted by the ghosts of schematics and equations, of a life so completely eviscerated it felt like a dream he'd once had. He couldn't bear to look for more than a second. He was an invisible man, a piece of human driftwood washed up in a sea of prosperity. He watched the parade of life that ignored him. Women in expensive trench coats walking tiny manicured dogs, businessmen with phone-molded ears striding purposefully toward unseen destinations, young lovers laughing as they shared a soft pretzel. The world was a vibrant, moving tapestry, and he was a single, frayed thread, torn loose and forgotten. Flashes of the past ambushed him in these quiet, cold moments. He remembered the lab, the beautiful, chaotic sanctuary of next-gen dynamics. He remembered the scent of hot solder and the low, constant hum of the servers, a sound that was like music to him. He remembered the exhilarating rush of discovery at 3 a.m, standing before a whiteboard covered in a language only he and one other person truly understood, the elegant beauty of a quantum mechanical equation finally clicking into place. He saw his wife's face, her smile as she brought him coffee, her gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't forget to save the world, Rob," she'd whisper, "but try to get some sleep first." The memory was a shard of glass in his heart. That man, the brilliant, driven engineer from Carnegie Mellon, the adoring husband, the visionary who was on the cusp of changing the world, was dead. He had been murdered, not with a weapon, but with a pen, a lawyer, and a calculated sociopathic act of betrayal. Damian Price had been the executioner. Now his universe had collapsed to the dimensions of this single park bench. His ambition had been reduced to the singular, primal goal of surviving until the next sunrise. Tucked deep inside his coat, wrapped in a carefully folded, slightly damp napkin he'd salvaged from a bin outside a patisserie, was his most valuable asset, the last third of a stale baguette. He could feel its hardened crust against his ribs, a small, solid anchor in the swirling vortex of his misery. It was his dinner for today. If he could muster the discipline of a starving monk, chewing each bite until it dissolved into tasteless paste, it might also be his breakfast tomorrow. The gnawing ache in his stomach was a constant companion, a dull, throbbing reminder of his complete and utter failure. This bread was real. This cold was real. And in this cruel, glittering world, it was all he had left. The sound was almost imperceptible at first, a tiny, sharp thread of distress woven into the thick fabric of the city's afternoon ambience. It was nearly lost beneath the rumble of a passing bus, the distant wail of a siren, and the cheerful chatter of people leaving the surrounding high-rise offices. But to Robert, whose senses were honed to the slightest variations in his environment, it was as clear as a bell. It was the hiccuping, desperate sob of a very young child. His head, which had been bowed against the wind, snapped up. His eyes, heavy-lidded and weary, scanned the square, past the laughing students and the purposeful businessmen. There, near the ornate wrought-iron fence that separated the park from the bustling street, stood a small, solitary figure. She was a little girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, a tiny, immaculate doll that seemed to have been dropped from another, cleaner world into the grime of this one. She was dressed in a vibrant pink wool coat of such fine quality that it seemed to glow in the fading light. Her feet were shod in shiny black patent leather shoes, now scuffed with dirt and gravel. A matching pink ribbon, which had once held her fine blonde hair in a perfect bouncing ponytail, was now askew, hanging limply like a small flag of her distress. Her face, a perfect cherubic oval, was a mess of tear tracks that cut clean paths through a light dusting of city dust. Her small shoulders, wrapped in the expensive wool, shook with each heart-wrenching silent sob. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. Robert's first deeply ingrained instinct was to make himself smaller, to look away, to melt back into the anonymity of the bench. Survival on the streets was a game of not being seen. Getting involved was a fool's gambit. He was a social leper, a pariah, and a disheveled, bearded man approaching a lost, wealthy-looking child was not a scene of compassion in this city. It was the prologue to a nightmare. He could already feel the suspicious glares, hear the shouted accusations, imagine the rough hands of a police officer on his shoulder, his day spiraling from quiet misery into active persecution. He watched as a stream of well-dressed Philadelphians flowed around her, their paths diverging like a river around a stone. A businessman barked into his phone, swerving to avoid her without breaking stride. A pair of tourists, engrossed in a map, gave her a fleeting, annoyed glance. A young woman jogging with headphones in didn't even seem to register her existence. Each person was locked in their own private world, their bubbles of self-interest as impenetrable as armor. The little girl was invisible to them, just as he was. But her quiet sobs began to escalate, punctuated by a raw panic that resonated with a long dormant part of Robert's soul, the part that had once been a man, a husband, a person who cared about order and decency. "Mommy? Daddy?" she called out, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper that the wind seemed to snatch away before it could travel more than a few feet. The sound lanced through Robert's apathy. He had seen this casual, unthinking cruelty every day for 10 years. He had become inured to it, a necessary callous on his soul. The world had taken his past and his future, stripped him down to nothing but painful memories and the cold, hard present. But as he listened to that lonely, frightened voice, he realized it hadn't taken everything. Deep within the burnt-out ruin of his life, a single, deeply buried ember of the man he used to be, the man who believed in solving problems, in shielding the innocent, in doing the right thing simply because it was right, began to glow with a faint, defiant heat. The risk was enormous, but the cost of doing nothing, of letting that little girl's fear curdle into terror while he sat there, felt infinitely greater. He wouldn't do it. He couldn't. Taking a slow, deliberate breath that scraped against his raw lungs like sandpaper, Robert began the arduous process of pushing himself to his feet. His body, a machine long neglected and abused by the elements, protested with a chorus of creaks and groans from his knees and back. He moved with a cautious, shuffling gait, his worn-out shoes scraping softly on the flagstone path. He was acutely aware of how he must appear to the world, a fearsome, unkempt figure from a cautionary tale. He consciously tried to soften his presence, running a hand through his matted hair in a futile attempt to smooth it, hunching his shoulders to seem smaller, and forcing a neutral, non-threatening expression onto his face. He stopped a respectful 15 feet from the girl, not wanting to startle her into running into the street. "Hey there, little one," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, shocking even to his own ears. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and loud, and tried again, forcing a gentler tone. "Are you lost? Is everything okay?" The girl flinched violently at the sound of his voice, her head snapping up as if he had fired a gun. Her tear-filled blue eyes, wide and swimming with fear, took in his ragged appearance, the wild beard, the grimy coat, the gaunt and haunted face. Her tiny hands clenched the straps of the small unicorn backpack on her shoulders as if it were a life raft. And she took a fearful, stumbling step backward, her shiny shoes crunching on the loose gravel. "It's okay. Don't be scared," Robert said quickly, raising his hands slowly, palms open, in the universal gesture of peace. He remembered reading that this was less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise. I just saw you crying and I thought maybe I could help. Where are your mommy and daddy?" Her only answer was a fresh wave of sobs, her bottom lip trembling uncontrollably. She was too frightened to speak. Her gaze, however, dropped from his face to his coat pocket, where the knobby, protruding end of his baguette was visible. The sob was punctuated by a small, involuntary hiccup, a sound that was not of grief, but of a deep, childish hunger. In that single, pathetic sound, Robert understood. Her distress was a primal cocktail of fear and need. A decision formed in his mind, swift and absolute, bypassing all logic of self-preservation. This bread was his shield against the coming night. It was his only certainty for the next 24 hours, the one tangible thing standing between him and the dizzying, nauseating pangs of true, gnawing starvation. Giving it away was an act of profound recklessness, and yet, in that moment, it felt like the only sane thing to do. He reached into his coat, his rough, calloused fingers fumbling with the carefully folded napkin. He unfolded it with a reverence usually reserved for holy texts and held out the piece of bread. "Here," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "You look hungry. It's not much, I'm afraid, and it's a bit hard, but it's what I have." The girl hesitated, her gaze flickering from the offered bread to his face and back again. She was a child of privilege, certainly taught to be wary of strangers, especially strangers who looked and smelled like him. But perhaps a child's intuition is purer than an adult's prejudice. In his tired, sad eyes, she saw no menace, no trickery, only a profound and weary gentleness that transcended his squalor. Slowly, as if in a trance, she reached out her small, gloved hand. Her fingers, soft and warm, brushed against his own chapped, icy skin as she took the bread. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She brought it to her lips and took a small, tentative bite. A faint, sad smile touched Robert's lips as he watched her. The gnawing emptiness in his own stomach seemed to lessen, filled for a moment not with food, but with a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in a decade. The feeling of being useful. He had just given away everything he owned, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel poor. "Amaya! Mia! My God, Mia!" The voice was not a shout. It was a detonation. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated panic, a sound of such raw terror and command that it momentarily silenced the entire corner of the park. A man burst through the nearest gate on Walnut Street, moving with the explosive force of a man who believed the world should part for him. And it did. People instinctively scrambled out of his path. He was the very picture of predator-class power and success. His suit, a deep charcoal pinstripe that Robert recognized as a custom Brioni, was flawlessly tailored to his athletic, imposing frame. A shimmering platinum silk tie was knotted perfectly at his throat, and a set of sapphire cufflinks gleamed at his wrists. His shoes, handcrafted Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine, thundered on the flagstones as he ran, his handsome, patrician face a mask of a parent's ultimate nightmare. When his frantic, wild eyes finally landed on his daughter, his precious Mia, standing next to a ragged homeless man, the terror on his face was instantly replaced by a tidal wave of immense relief. This, however, was followed in the very next heartbeat by a swift, suspicious narrowing of his eyes. "Mia! Oh, thank God!" he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion as he closed the distance in a few long, desperate strides. He didn't slow down, simply swooped in and scooped the little girl into his arms, crushing her against his expensive suit in a hug that was both fiercely protective and trembling with residual fear. "I was so worried. I told you never, ever to run off like that. Never!" He rained kisses on the top of her blonde head, his whole body shaking with the adrenaline of his recent terror. He was muttering to her, a stream of frantic endearments and gentle admonishments. Then his attention shifted. He looked over his daughter's head at Robert, who had remained perfectly still, a silent, shabby sentinel. The man's expression became a complex, rapidly shifting amalgam of emotions. Gratitude warred with revulsion. Relief battled with suspicion. He was assessing Robert not as a person, but as a potential threat, a problem to be managed and dismissed. "Thank you," he said, his voice still breathless but already regaining its usual cadence of command. "Thank you for staying with her." He gently set Mia down on her feet, though he kept a firm, proprietary hand on her shoulder, subtly moving her behind him. He then reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his movements fluid and practiced. A gesture he had surely made thousands of times. He produced a thick, gleaming money clip, not silver, but platinum, fat with $100 bills. With an effortless flick of his thumb, he peeled off a single crisp bill and held it out to Robert. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, away from his body, as if it were a contaminated specimen. "Here," he said, his tone that of a king bestowing a coin upon a peasant. "For your trouble." Robert didn't move. He didn't even glance at the money that was being offered to him like a treat to a dog. His gaze was locked on the man's face, a face he had once seen every single day. He saw the strong, patrician jawline, now a bit fuller. He saw the piercing gray eyes that radiated an unshakable, arrogant certainty. And he saw the scar, the faint, silvery line that cut a tiny diagonal path through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a celebratory champagne bottle that had gotten away from them the night they secured their first round of funding. The world around Robert seemed to slow to a crawl, the sounds of the city, the traffic, the voices, the distant clang of the trolley, fading into a dull underwater roar. The air grew thick and heavy, each particle charged with the weight of a decade of unresolved history. A deep, frozen reservoir of rage, a hate so profound he thought it had died of starvation years ago, began to thaw in his veins, a volcanic pressure building beneath the surface of his calm. A jolt, cold and violently electric, shot through Robert Hayes's entire being. It was not a memory returning. It was the past slamming into the present with the force of a physical collision. The air was stolen from his lungs, his vision tunneled until the only thing in existence was the face of the man before him. A face that had haunted his waking nightmares and poisoned his dreams for 10 agonizing years. It couldn't be. Not here, not now. After all the grinding, soul-crushing years the universe had spent erasing him, it couldn't be this cruelly, perfectly ironic. But it was. The face was older, hardened by a decade of ruthless success. The faint lines around the eyes were not from laughter, but from stress and intense focus. But it was unmistakably, irrefutably him. Damian Price. The name was a curse, a 2-word spell of ruin he hadn't dared to speak aloud in a decade, for fear it would shatter what little remained of his fractured sanity. The memory, a monster he had locked away in the deepest, most fortified dungeon of his mind, broke free of its chains. It came roaring out, not as a single wave, but as a flood of excruciatingly vivid sensations. He was suddenly 28 again, standing in the cramped, wonderfully chaotic lab of their fledgling startup, Next Gen Dynamics. The air smelled of ambition, lukewarm coffee, and the unique sharp scent of ozone from the humming server racks. He saw himself and Damien, 2 brilliant, arrogant kids fresh out of Carnegie Mellon, bound by a shared vision of a better world powered by clean, limitless energy. Robert was the quiet architect, the introverted genius whose mind was a beautiful, intricate cathedral of schematics and equations. Damien was the silver-tongued salesman, the charismatic force of nature who could charm venture capitalists and engineers with equal effortless skill. They were a perfect team. He remembered the endless, exhilarating nights, fueled by cheap pizza and a shared dream, the whiteboards covered in a secret language that traced the path to their masterpiece, the Apex generator. It was Robert's magnum opus, a revolutionary technology for decentralized, clean energy production that would have made the entire global energy grid obsolete. It was a technology that would have democratized power for the entire planet. He remembered the triumphant handshake, the brotherly pact they'd made over cheap beer in a dive bar, toasting to a future where they would be not just rich, but significant. And then, with the gut-wrenching clarity of a fresh wound, he remembered the betrayal. He was transported to the precise, horrifying moment he had arrived at the lab to find the door's lock changed. He remembered the ignored calls, the text that went unread, the eventual, smugly worded certified letter from a high-powered law firm, informing him that his consulting services were no longer required. He remembered the soul-destroying discovery that Damien, his partner, his brother, had secretly filed every single one of Robert's patents under a new corporate entity, Price Technologies, using a web of forged documents and legal loopholes so intricate and well-funded that Robert's protests were rendered pathetic. The legal battle was a public execution. Robert, with his dwindling savings and a bewildered public defender, against Damien's smiling army of corporate sharks. He remembered the specific, humiliating scene in the courtroom where Damien's lead counsel painted him as an unstable, glorified assistant with delusions of grandeur. He lost everything: his life's work, his company, his reputation, his home. And in the crushing, suffocating despair that followed, he had lost his wife, who had watched the brilliant man she loved disintegrate into a paranoid, broken shell before her eyes. "I can't watch you do this to yourself anymore, Rob," she had said, her voice thick with tears, the day she left. "He didn't just take the company, he's letting you kill yourself." Damien Price had not just stolen an invention, he had meticulously, methodically, and maliciously dismantled Robert Hayes's entire existence. And now, this architect of ruin, this ghost from his own personal hell, was standing here, offering him $100 for saving his daughter. The irony was so profound, so hideously perfect, it felt like the universe was telling its sickest joke. The $100 bill, crisp and immaculate, fluttered in Damien Price's manicured hand. It was a flimsy green rectangle, yet it represented an insult of such monumental, soul-crushing proportions that it bordered on the cosmic. It was a perfect symbol of Damien's entire philosophy, that any problem, any person, any act of human decency could be assigned a price, paid for, and dismissed. A dark, cold rage, an emotion Robert thought had withered and died in him years ago from sheer neglect, began to smolder in the pit of his stomach. It was a clean, pure fury, a righteous fire that burned away a decade of accumulated apathy and despair, leaving behind a core of hardened steel. He slowly, deliberately raised his head. The haunted, hollow look that had been his constant companion was gone, seared away by the heat of his anger. His eyes, now clear and focused, bored into Damien's with a laser-like intensity that made the powerful CEO unconsciously take a half-step back. The flicker of recognition in Damien's arrogant gray eyes finally ignited, followed swiftly by a wave of undisguised revulsion and a flash of pure animal panic. This was a complication from a past he had buried and paved over with gold. "You," Robert rasped, his voice a gravelly echo of its former self, yet it carried the weight of a decade of suffering. The single word landed between them with the physical force of a thrown stone. Damien Price. Damien's face, which had been a mask of paternal concern just moments before, hardened into a sheet of polished ice. His brief transactional gratitude instantly evaporated, replaced by the cold corporate stonewall he used to crush any and all opposition. He subtly shifted his stance, putting himself more squarely between Robert and his daughter, as if Robert were a contagion, a foul disease from the gutter. "I think you're mistaken," Damien said, his tone clipped and frigid, each word a perfectly formed icicle. "My name is Damien Price, yes, but I have never seen you before in my life. You have my thanks for watching my daughter. Now, if you'll excuse us." "Mistaken?" A raw, guttural laugh, completely devoid of humor, clawed its way out of Robert's throat. The sound was so jarring and full of pain that a nearby couple instinctively flinched and hurried away. "Oh, I'm not mistaken, Damien. I could forget my own name before I forgot yours. I'd recognize the man who stole my soul in the darkest pit of hell. Remember Next-Gen Dynamics? Remember the night we almost set the lab on fire with the capacitor overload in A block? Remember what we called Project Chimera before we settled on the Apex generator? He took a shambling, determined step forward, fueled by a sudden surge of adrenaline. Or did you conveniently forget the name of the man whose entire life you systematically destroyed to build your disgusting, fraudulent empire? Panic, stark and undeniable, flashed in Damien's eyes. He shot a nervous glance around the park, his corporate mind instantly calculating the potential for a public scene, for damaging exposure. "That's enough," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "You are a delusional, rambling vagrant. You're clearly unwell, and you're harassing me and my child. I'm going to give you one chance to walk away." He reached for the sleek smartphone in his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen, ready to summon the forces of order he had always used to protect his disordered world. "If you don't back away from us right now, I will call the police and have you arrested for assault and trespassing. Do you understand me?" He was ready to swat Robert away like a fly, to have him disappeared into the system, a system that always favored men like him over men like Robert. But Robert didn't flinch. He didn't cower. The worst had already happened to him. There was nothing left to fear. He was a ghost who had come back to haunt his murderer, and he had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Go ahead, Damien. Call them," Robert said, his voice gaining a chilling, resonant strength that seemed to emanate not from his emaciated frame, but from the very ground beneath his feet. It was the voice of a man who had hit rock bottom and found it to be solid ground. "Call the police. Call your army of lawyers in their $1,000 suits. They can't unsay what I am about to say. They can't unknow what you are about to be reminded of." He took another step closer, deliberately invading Damien's carefully maintained personal space. For the first time in his adult life, the powerful, untouchable Damien Price took an involuntary, stumbling step back, his composure beginning to crack. "But before you make that call," Robert continued, his eyes burning with an almost prophetic fire, "you should know something. I may live on a park bench, but I still know how to read. I've been following your company, your big, splashy announcement scheduled for next week. The Price Fusion Core. A brilliant name, very catchy, but it's just my Apex generator with a new logo and $1 billion marketing budget, isn't it?" Damien's face, already pale, turned a sickly grayish-white under his expensive, carefully cultivated tan. "You're insane. That's proprietary, revolutionary technology, developed over a decade by the best minds in the field." "Am I?" A predatory smile, a terrifying skeletal grin on his haggard face, stretched Robert's lips. "Because when you stole my designs, you were in a hurry, Damien. You were always the salesman, the showman, never the engineer. You copied the blueprints, but you never bothered to truly understand the complex quantum mechanics that underpinned them. You stole the car, but you never learned how to handle it at high speeds. You never understood the elegant, intricate fail-safes I was still designing when you and your lawyers gutted my lab and my life." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was far more terrifying than a shout. A whisper meant only for Damien, a ghost's secret shared with his killer. "So tell me, Damien, what happens to the core's magnetic containment field when it reaches 72% of its projected maximum output for more than 180 seconds? Did your team of high-priced, world-class engineers figure that out? Did my stolen research happen to mention the precise term harmonic resonance cascade?" The color drained completely from Damien Price's face. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening slightly in a silent, horrified gasp, as if he'd been punched in the gut. That specific, obscure technical phrase, that precise, catastrophic failure point. It wasn't just a ghost from a nightmare. It was the single, unsolvable glitch that had his entire engineering division in a state of quiet, abject panic for the last 6 months. It was the ticking time bomb at the very heart of his multi-billion-dollar product launch. A secret so closely guarded, so deeply buried in technical reports, that only 5 people in the entire world were supposed to know about it. And now, a sixth, a ghost from the past, a specter in rags, standing before him in a public park, had just whispered it into his ear. He felt a wave of vertigo, leaning against a nearby elm tree for support. There was only one person in the universe who could know about that flaw with such terrifying, absolute certainty: its true creator. A few feet away, a young woman in a practical, weather-beaten jacket, who had been quietly documenting the park's homeless population for a feature story, slowly lowered her DSLR camera. Her name was Eva Tanaka, and her journalistic instincts were screaming. She had pressed the record button on her high-fidelity audio device the moment the homeless man had said "Apex Generator." Now her eyes were wide with the electrifying realization that she was no longer covering a story about poverty. She was witnessing the unearthing of the biggest, most explosive corporate scandal of the decade. She zoomed her lens in, focusing on the two men, capturing the ruin on one face and the righteous fury on the other. The aftermath was not a storm. It was a corporate apocalypse, swift and merciless. The journalist, Eva Tanaka, a hungry, ambitious reporter, knew she possessed more than a story. She possessed a weapon of mass professional destruction. Her article, published on the front page of a major online news outlet under the explosive headline, "The Ghost in the Square: How Tech Titan Damian Price Built Price Technologies on a Stolen Dream and a Lie," went viral in less than an hour. It was a perfectly crafted narrative of genius, betrayal, and staggering hubris, made unassailable by the damning, crystal-clear audio recording. The world could hear Robert Hayes, his voice raw with a decade of pain, calmly and precisely describing the fatal flaw in the Price fusion core, followed by Damian Price's stammering, panicked denials. The effect on the financial world was instantaneous and catastrophic. Wall Street reacted with abject, primal terror. Price Technologies stock, the undisputed darling of the tech sector, plummeted by 93% in pre-market trading before the Nasdaq mercifully halted it, trying to staunch the bleeding. Over $200 billion of market value evaporated in minutes. The board of directors, facing an apocalyptic avalanche of shareholder lawsuits and an immediate, aggressive federal investigation into corporate fraud, intellectual property theft, and criminal negligence, convened an emergency meeting that lasted 17 minutes. Before the sun had set on Philadelphia, Damian Price was forced to resign in utter, irrevocable disgrace. The much-hyped product launch was canceled, and the global empire he had built on a foundation of deceit and ruthlessness began to crumble into dust, its name becoming a permanent synonym for corporate evil. For Robert Hayes, the world transformed with a speed that was almost dizzying, a surreal whiplash of fortune. The viral story brought him not just public vindication, but a deluge of opportunities from every corner of the tech world. Chief among them was a call from the CEO of Phoenix Systems, Price's biggest and most ethical competitor. They didn't just want to hire him, they wanted to build a kingdom for him. Within a month, Robert Hayes was no longer a ghost on a park bench. He was the executive director and chief scientist of the new, lavishly funded Apex Project division. He was given a state-of-the-art laboratory that dwarfed his old one, a hand-picked team of the country's brightest young engineers who looked at him with awe and reverence, and a research budget that was essentially a blank check. The final, poetic image of the saga played out on two different screens across the nation. On the 24-hour news cycle, a haggard, broken-looking Damian Price, his flawless Brioni suit rumpled and stained, was escorted from his Rittenhouse Square penthouse in handcuffs by a team of stone-faced federal agents. His face, once a mask of arrogant power, was now a portrait of hollow defeat as he was pushed into the back of an unmarked sedan, his legacy reduced to a single humiliating perp walk. At that very same moment, on a sleek, wall-sized holographic monitor in a pristine, gleaming laboratory in Silicon Valley, a clean-shaven, revitalized Robert Hayes stood before a glowing three-dimensional blueprint of his engine. He wore a crisp new suit under a white lab coat, and his eyes, clear and brilliant, shone with purpose. He tapped a command on a nearby console, and the intricate schematic whirled to life, pulsing with a brilliant, clean blue light that filled the room. He was no longer a man defined by what had been stolen from him, but by what he was now, finally, free to give the world. He took a deep breath, the air clean and filtered, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt the familiar, thrilling hum of the future. Justice, like his long-delayed invention, had not been denied, merely deferred, and its arrival was magnificent.